can't hear me, why, raise your hand or do something so that you can understand what I'm saying. I don't want to be up here just mumbling, which I could do, of course. And as I look around, I see there's several people who are older than I am who probably have better and longer memories of Anthon than I do, but I do have some, and we'll try to go through them. I'll try to go through some buildings first, some of the buildings around, and then some of the people that was around there, and try to keep it fairly short. First of all, I want to start a little bit about the railroad, because without the railroad, there wouldn't be an Anthon. I mean, we all might be having lunch out at Holly's Lucky Valley if the railroad hadn't. And of course, when I think about the railroad, I think of the west end of Main Street before the bridge was there, where we always had the sweet show, which was quite a thing when I was a kid. I don't ever remember going to a movie with my parents, for example, but I don't think we ever missed a sweet show. And there was always big crowds, and it was kind of strange because this would have been in the 30s when most people didn't have much extra cash to spread around. But there was always a good crowd at the sweet shows. And then, of course, the old depot was there, the two-story one before they built the other one. And just north of that, Wolf Lumber Company coal bins. And then beyond that, the stockyards where Jim Burke bought hogs. And we shipped cattle out of it. As a matter of fact, I even shipped fat cattle in Chicago out of the Anthon depot. It was quite a thing. And then, of course, going south from there, the elevator, and then on the south end was the section hand house, which was a little bit like the depot. It was a two-story one, and I don't remember people actually living there like the Cunningham, Tom, and Joe, who worked for the railroad. But the last people I remember that lived there was George and Doris Bureau lived in that house, and I think that was about the last people who lived there. Of course, then it got tore down. And across from the elevator, there was a portion of the old schoolhouse that came from the town park that was moved there right across from the elevator. I remember that, and it was used by a guy, I think, with the name of Guthridge, who was a house mover. And I think he lived up with, or boarded or something with Minnie Taylor, who lived up in the north end of town. But going back to starting with some of the first block around there, of course, was Wolf Lumber Company, and then north of that was a big old building that was used for various things as a duck bowling alley and a roller skating ring and a cream station. And then the auxiliary was going to redo it and make it just a single story thing. They dug a basement, cut the story off. Johnny Osborne was doing the work. And then they had a big rain before got it done, and everything fell in the hole. It was just quite a sad deal, but that's the way it happened. And then just north of that was a couple little office buildings, and I don't know if they were single or if they were together, but there were two office buildings there, and one was Doc O'Neill had his dentist thing, and the other one was Nels Nelson, who managed all the insurance company farms in the area, which there were, I think, like 111 that he managed that were owned by the insurance companies due to the fact of the Depression and people lost their farms. And then, of course, there was an old building there where the only thing I ever remember that was in it was a lady by the name of Hallie Rader had a restaurant in it briefly, and that's where the fireside started. Name right off. And Russ Spots started the fireside there, and there was also, before he started in there was a laundromat. A guy by the name of Sheldon from Correctionville built a laundromat in there. And then, of course, Pitkin Drug Store, and then the grocery store. That the first guy that I remember that was Lou Foley. And maybe somebody who can remember, there's older people here than I am that can remember who had a Lou Foley. And then going north was the John Deere dealership, D. Beaver, and north of that was an old tie barn, which was used for Woodbury County to store their maintainers in. And of course, across the street was our building where I was for quite a few years, and then going around Garrison, Win Garrison and his wife Nell, and Teresa Eisenmeyer, who always took care of the dry goods and stuff in there, and she was quite a treasure. And then of course Bert Hart had his drugstore right next door, and then Tom and Dan, Tom Coyne and Dan Curtin had a bar next door, which is where the little saloon is now. And there was a little restaurant in there too, where Danny Fitzpatrick and Ralph Wilson's wife, mother, ran that, and
Dry cleaners.
beg pardon?
The dry cleaners, Anna
Oh,
Wilson.
no, I'm thinking of a little restaurant in there.
Oh, Fay Icorn.
Fay Icorn. Very nice. Okay, and then there was of course the Walker plant, which Marvin was in at one time, but the first ones that I can remember in there was a guy by the name of Howard Struckmine. Yeah. And then after that was Vogel or Bill Ferns, or several people who were in that building. And then Abe Livermore had a tavern, and then there was a place where I think where they made Harold's, Whitmer, up there. And at one time, Ernie Judd, I don't remember this of course, but I remember Ernie telling me he ran sold cars out of that old building, which would have been right next to the Standard Oil station that Johnny Peterson ran. And if you go back to the old hotel down at the west end of the other block, that was tore down, and that movie theater was built in there by a guy by the name of Sandberg, who built that, and of course now Wade Nelson owns it. Bill Mack built a building next to it, which is, I think Paulson's have that. I don't know for sure what it's used for or what it's going to be used for, but Paulson's own that now. And then there was some buildings in there where the Hudgell had their funeral home and a furniture store. And I don't remember Dick Hudgell. I should, but I don't. But I do remember his son Eddie, who ran it for many years. And later on, Doc O'Neill was moved across the street. He was there, and in the same building with Edith Culver Forsling, who was our only lady attorney that I can remember anyway. And then there was a cleaning shop in there, and a barber shop, and Anthon Herald, and then Thayer Hardware, and of course the bank. And then going south from the bank, where the little Solutions are now, was at that time that I first remembered was the post office. And a guy that was postmaster at that time was T.B. O'Donnell. He was quite an old gentleman, but that's. And then on down the street was the library, and Jerry Emhofer had a little radio shop in there, and there was a gas station. And across the street, of course, was Ray Wilson built that building, and then there was the old theater, which was originally started by Frank Lyons, Charlie and Archie Lyons' dad. he came to town from Correctionville to open up that, and had that until he sold his name of Jensen. Anyway, and then of course Bill Rohr was there forever, and after the theater building, R.W. Madison was in there for a good number of years. And across the street in that block building, from the Rohr's cream station was Frank Shue had another cream station there, and then the next one north, of course, was Sam Casole, and next to Sam's was his wife Sarah, who had a dry goods place. And some little interesting thing about Sarah was that she and her sister homesteaded a quarter section of ground out in South Dakota when she was a young girl. I didn't know that until a few years ago. Her daughter, Joy, who was a good friend of Lorna's, told me about it, which was kind of an unusual thing for two women, but that's part of the deal. Talking about some unusual things, when the railroad left, I kind of forgot, but we rented the ground for some used machinery, and then got the new depot building, and it was full of the invoices and bills and stuff from the railroad company. And two of the things that were in there that really surprised me somewhat was one, there were hundreds, literally hundreds of bills, invoices, whatever you want to call them, where Frank Gothier had shipped out individual reading bank to all over the United States and Canada. And the other thing that is something you probably will remember is they used to get baby chickens in there. They'd come by rail. And they'd come in a box about 3 foot square, maybe 6 or 8 inches high with some holes in it. But the station agent, who was Ernie Shirley or Ram, I forget which one, but they had to count them and then deduct from everything however many died. And there always were some dead ones in there. Sometimes they were almost all dead. But it was this, I never realized until it did that they shipped chickens, day-old chickens. I don't know where they came from, if they came from Cherokee or where, but they came to Anthon, and there were always a few dead ones. Anyway, going up the street from Sarah Casole was the Craig brothers had a tavern in there, and there was a barber shop, and a guy by the name of Dwayne Wenberg one time had a bar in the building that is now the Legion Hall. And then Doc Ward had his office was in there, and the pool hall run by Frank Galvin, as I first remember it. And then the Oddfellows Hall was the last one, and that's where Umbaugh Feed and Grain is now. And a little interesting thing about that, when they tore that building down, they discovered there was a skeleton in there, and it caused quite a little stink for a little while, but they finally determined that the Oddfellows used this skeleton somehow or other in their rights. Maybe that's why they call them the Oddfellows. But anyway, and then of course across the street, Jim Holdsworth had a shop. And Ralph, you may remember this better than I do, but was there a ice house across the street about where Jim Holdsworth was at one time, the ice house?
The ice house is where your store was, at the corner north, and then east, just east to where your building was.
Well, yes, I know there was one right to the east of the building, but it was just a little one. They had a little retail shop out there. Barry Connolly ran that, along with Frank Hardeman.
Yeah.
But I think the big storage one was down there about where Jim Holdsworth's shop was, but I'm not 100% sure of that. Do you remember, Marvin?
No. I'm an import. I moved from South Dakota in '37 down here, so.
Okay, we're gonna let you
Well,
off the hook.
From there on.
Okay, well, anyway, that's about all I remember as far as the buildings downtown are concerned. We did have the one building that I remember very well the old tie barn that was used to store county maintainers in burned up. And Beaver's John Deere dealership was right there too, but I don't think it burned. It was just the old tie barn that burned. And then of course across the street, big fire from our old building. And the Methodist church right here was quite a fire as well. And then of course the schoolhouse was a tremendous fire. And it wasn't maybe as big a fire, but quite a fire was the Catholic school burned, and a guy by the name of Newt White was a hero. He helped and maybe even carried a couple of the sisters down on a long ladder, because there were at one time 4 floors there. So that was and some houses that burned around. Was across the street from the Catholic church was the Thayer house, which was a big old house, and Ray Hoffman bought it, and it burned down. And Coyne house, Tom Coyne's house burned, and I'm trying to think of another one that, well, in the west end of the town, there was a house that Evan and Pork Umbaugh lived in. That had been moved to town from when Galen Heyman built a new home. He built that, and they brought it in, and it caught fire, and it was eventually rebuilt, and Bob Kindig lived in there. And those were about the only fires that I can think around town that really, and unfortunately, I don't think we ever had a loss of life or anything, but there were some of the fires. Some of the old boys that used to sit around on the benches that I remember very well was Vet Dix. That was a good friend of mine and knew a lot about the old part of town. He remembered very well when they brought the dredge in to straighten the river started out at the river bridge out here and went down as far as Smithland. And I think that happened in 1915, according to Vet. And of course, Walt and Johnny Flynn were there on the bench, and Joe and Ray Schulze were often there, as was Bogey Taft, and Kenny Livermore, and Gene Galvin. I don't know, depends on how old you are, if some of those names are familiar or not, but, and George Walden. He is someone that I doubt very many of you knew, but I happen to know him because he worked for my dad for a while building some buildings. And we used to have a lot of truckers in town. There was, Nick Lawrenson was the oldest one, and he still was driving a hard rubber tired truck. And he would have been the great grandfather of John Wilson. His daughter was, Nick Lawrence's daughter was married to Ray Wilson, and Ray's son was Ralph Wilson, and Ralph's son was John Wilson. So anyway, and there was Ernie Russell, Freddie Hansen, Elmer Siefke, Albert Stender, John Stender, Marvin Huffman, his brother Lloyd, and Eldon Brown, who came in quite a little bit later. But when I got thinking about Eldon Brown, something come up that I have wondered about, and can't seem to find much about it. But where Eldon moved, I think there used to be a church there. In fact, I'm quite sure. Yeah. And a guy by the name of Fay Hannon was the pastor or something, and they had a daughter, Wanda, who started school in our class. She only went about a year and left, but I don't remember it, and I looked in our history books, and there really isn't anything about it. I don't know really much about that church at all. If anybody knows, I'd be interested in hearing from you after we're done here, but I can't find anything out about that. Well, I don't know if you'd like me to quit, but I do have no end of information. But some of the people that I hope that you remember or think that you may, of course, obviously, Frank Ophir, who was almost most anything you could think of. He was an entrepreneur, he was a big rancher, he was a cattle rancher, he was he was in the Cowboy Hall of Fame out in the West. He homesteaded in western South Dakota. He really was quite an individual. And of course, and then going up the street, some of the people that run the business, there was Andy Wolf, who was always tip your hat to the ladies if you ever met a lady on the street. And of course, Doc O'Neill, Nels Nelson, Roy Pitkin, Lou Foley, Wynn Garrison, D. Beaver, Bert Hart, of course, and Bill Ferns, just a lot of those older people, Ernie Jett, Sam Reynolds, who ran the Quaker Oats deal for years, and of course Judge Forsley, who lived in Anthon. He was not a businessman, but Judge was always around, and Murph Thayer, and just a lot of people. I know I'm missing a lot of them, but I just simply don't remember them all, nor do we have time to find them out. Some of the women that I remember very well was Clara Rohr. Clara was unforgettable. She taught me the first 3 years in country school, but she was, and she and Bill ran the cream station forever. Sarah Casole, of course, I've talked about before, who homesteaded out in South Dakota. Agnes Lester, Pauline Pitkin, Myrtle Hart, Teresa Eisenmenger, who was, she should be in heaven if she isn't. She was, and Nellie Cover, Lucille O'Neill, Nell Garrison, and some of the ladies who cooked a lot around town, Marcella Woods, and Kate Sadler, and Mildred Buck, Faye Eichhorn, Marie Campbell, and then another lady that was around a lot that I always admired her anyway was Hazel Arnold, who worked for R.W. Madison forever. And another one who knew virtually everything all the way back as far as Anthon was. And I had lunch with her several times in the old restaurant on the south side of the street. And by accident was Leila Fisher. She moved in that house about the time Anthon was founded in '88. Her father was one of the original guys who had a merchandise. He was a Fisher, obviously. And but Leila really knew all the old deals in town, and how I happened to get to know her and be around her a little bit was one noon I went down there, which I often did for lunch, and it was all the seats were taken, and she invited me to join her and Elaine, who was I'm not sure if that was her daughter or what, but anyway, I had lunch with them and did a couple times. So anyway, that's about all I really have to say. I'd probably be a little remiss if I didn't mention a couple relatives of mine. Herman Heyman, who was quite instrumental in bringing the seed corn up to date, in that he was the first one that had a single cross corn, which is virtually all of the corn today is a single cross. And then my brother Rich, who donated the library and 1 year paid all the light bills for Christmas time for everyone in town. And of course, I think about it, Tom Hayworth, who was the town cop forever, and Bill Shrunk, who was everything. He was the town electrician, he was the town cop, he had a character. He was also the sheriff in town for until he fired off a few rounds through the ceiling at Tom and Dan's, as I understand it, and he took his gun away from him. Well, that's about all I have, and I appreciate your not booing, at least listening, and that's about it. But I would, if someone knows a little bit about this church, because there was, where Ellen Brown, and then and of course the Brown house burned too, I kind of forgot that. There was no one in it at the time, but anyway, it burned, but I don't know, and it seems like right there where that church was, and Ralph, you may know this too, like there were some Swansons living there. Shirley Swanson, I think, married June Anderson. And there was a boy who I think was in World War II. Swanson, right?
Bob.
Help with the name. Bob, according to my. Well, again, thank you for your time.